Hi, everyone. I'm Shannon Bernick. I'm an accessibility specialist with the OAS, and we're so glad that you could join us today as part of our First Year Fridays initiative. Today, we're going to be talking about making FSU your home. And a big part of that is making sure that all of your living needs related to your disability are being met while you're here on campus. And a big piece of how we can help do that is through approving housing accommodations. So today we'd like to walk you through that process. It is a combination of the OAS and housing that work together to make sure those accommodations are approved and then implemented. And then, of course, we're going to talk about some of the limitations of those housing accommodations and also some special circumstances that we get questions about pretty frequently. And then we're also going to have a Q&A session with housing so that they can address some of the common questions that we receive and also just offer any success tips for you that will contribute to you enjoying and making the most of your time on campus. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we're going to go ahead and minimize this. And so our topic today, of course, is making the most of living on campus. Primarily, I will be leading it. I am Shannon Bernick, an accessibility specialist at the Office of Accessibility Services. And then we do also have Sarah Dennis from University Housing, who is a program assistant. So she'll be able to offer a little more specific information about the housing side of it and answer some of those questions. And as I said, we're going to talk about who handles what. OAS and housing do work together for your housing accommodations, but we each have specific areas that we handle. We're going to talk about the process of applying, some of the limitations of housing accommodations, some of the differences between service animals and emotional support animals, some frequently asked questions that we get. We'll offer you an opportunity to ask your questions, and then we'll close with offering some success tips, just that we've kind of learned through trial and error, and then also making sure that you have our contact information so that you can reach out to us if you'd like to talk about more personal questions. So beginning with who handles what. The process, like I said, is an integrated process between the Office of Accessibility Services and University Housing, but each of our departments is responsible for a slightly different side of the process. So with the Office of Accessibility Services, you will need to go through our traditional application process and submit documentation of your diagnosis. That documentation is essential for our office to ensure that we can approve you for the housing accommodations that you need to meet your disability related needs. In this process, self-disclosure of your diagnosis then is required. That's how we ensure that there is a reason for the accommodations that you're being given. And of course, I do want you to know we understand a lot of times this information is very personal, it's very intimate, it can be very difficult to talk about. But of course, in order to ensure that you have what you need, we do need that self-disclosure and documentation. And of course, we are absolutely bound to confidentiality. So we will not disclose your information to anyone at any time without your prior approval. And we also do not require you to disclose it outside of our office. So you will see that even though University Housing is responsible for entering into that housing contract with you, you do not need to disclose your diagnosis to them at any time. If they have any questions about the specific accommodations that you've been approved for, they can always direct those to us, and we will answer those questions while ensuring that we maintain your confidentiality. Because you apply for and submit your documentation to us, when you go through the intake process, we'll go ahead and approve the accommodations that match your needs. However, on the flip side of that, housing will implement the accommodations. So, for example, if you are a student who has very specialized medication that you take that needs to be refrigerated, one of your housing accommodations may be approval of an extra refrigerator in your living space. So, we'll approve you for that extra refrigerator and we'll let housing know that you need it. Housing then will actually be responsible for making sure that that extra refrigerator is in your living space. And of course, this is always dependent on availability. One thing we're going to talk about later on is some of our deadlines, and those are important to follow in order to kind of increase your chances of having the availability of what you need. Though I will say that our housing does a tremendous job of really following through those accommodations, even if they do happen to be past the deadlines. And then, of course, if something were to change, you have a new diagnosis or perhaps an increase or flare up in your disability related symptoms, you can always reach out to the OAS. We can talk about your current housing situation, see what else might be beneficial for you, and do what we call an accommodations review. Now, sometimes that concern will be one related to a roommate that a student has. Unfortunately, we do not have any housing accommodations that are specifically related to roommate concerns. However, it's important to note that if you have a specific friend that you would feel very comfortable living with, you are able to make roommate requests through university housing prior to and during the contracting process. But it's important to note that even if you request a roommate who maybe is very familiar with your disability, that roommate still cannot serve as a personal care attendant. And of course, this is due to liability reasons. We can't put that responsibility on another student. We can't make that a requirement for them. Okay, so now that we've talked about the differences between the OAS and the housing responsibilities, we're going to go ahead and talk about the process overview. So it's important to know here in step one that you do have to have a housing contract in place before we can approve you for housing accommodations. Once that's in place, you can go ahead and complete the OAS online application. So, oftentimes, students who receive housing accommodations also receive academic or transportation accommodations as well. And this is the same application. So there's no need to submit more than one. You can just use that same application, will cover both your housing and academic needs. And of course, we did talk about those priority deadlines. So this PowerPoint will be posted with our recording, and you can always just click on these links here, which will take you to those priority deadlines so that you're sure you're getting them in on time. Now, the important piece that might be slightly different from your academic accommodations is the documentation that you submit. So, for example, if you have dual diagnosis, perhaps you have a diagnosis of ADHD and then also an IBS diagnosis. Of course, the ADHD would be strictly related to academic accommodations. However, with IBS, you may have a crossover of both academic and housing. So you'll want to be sure that you're submitting documentation that covers both diagnoses that you have. Of course, we want that to be dated within 5 years, and we want it to include a direct link to a housing accommodation request. So, for example, if you are someone who experiences a mobility impairment, you want to directly link that impairment to the request that you're making. So you may say that I experience fibromyalgia, which causes tremendous amount of pain, and it's not always easy for me to get up and down. So for that reason, I'm requesting that my bed frame be lowered. So there we can see the direct link between the symptom of your diagnosis and the accommodation that you're requesting. And then, of course, we do have a support form, both one for academic accommodations and one for housing accommodations. They're very simple. They're about 8 to 10 questions, and they're actually very similar to each other. But that's the opportunity for your provider to show us that direct link between your diagnosis and your accommodation request. So we highly recommend using that. It's really a very straightforward way to give our office all the information we need need, but at the same time, only the information that we need, because we know there's a lot of intimate personal information there that you might um, not feel comfortable sharing everything. Of course, once this is done and we have the application and the documentation that we need, we're going to ask that you schedule an intake appointment with an accessibility specialist. And you can do that by calling our main line. And of course, this number is also listed on our website, and it will also be listed in the emails that you get from our office once you submit your application and documentation. After you meet with an accessibility specialist for your intake appointment, we talk about your diagnosis, your documentation, your experience, and we find the best housing accommodations to meet your needs. We're going to go ahead and send over a direct request to University Housing, letting them know exactly what you've been approved for. And we always copy you on this email, so you will see exactly what we have sent to housing and when we have sent it to them. From that point, University Housing is going to take over. So if they have any questions about your housing accommodations, they will reach out to you if necessary, or of course, they will reach out to our office if they need clarification. We are in regular communication with each other. So we are often able to answer those questions right away and make sure that there's no delay in the implementation of the accommodations. And then, of course, housing will be the one to notify you of your housing assignment. And of course, as we talked about earlier, if anything were to come up that would your diagnosis changes or a new concern arises, you can always reach back out to the OAS and we can talk about it and we can see if there's any other housing accommodations that might help to meet your needs. So with that in mind, there are some limitations to the housing accommodations, and many of these are actually exactly noted just as they are on our website. So FSU is unable to provide a low distraction living environment accommodation based solely on a diagnosis of ADHD or a learning disability. And it's important to note that a lot of this fault goes back to the language of reasonable accommodation. And unfortunately, residential style living, dormitory style living, isn't necessarily conducive to low distractions. So we can never guarantee a low distraction environment based solely on ADHD or a learning disability. Also, FSU is not able to honor housing accommodations, requesting a specific room assignment, a specific residence hall, or a roommate. So we will meet your housing accommodation. We will give you that extra refrigerator. We will lower that bed frame, but we can't necessarily guarantee that it's going to be in a specific room or a specific residence hall. And of course, for those liability reasons, of course, we can't mandate that a roommate be your personal care attendant. Also, just due to the nature of living in Florida and living in a building that houses so many people, we also cannot guarantee a dust, mold, or allergen free housing accommodation. We can do things like change your air filters more frequently, but of course, we can never guarantee that it will be absolutely free of allergens. Two things that we'd like to distinguish between, because this comes up frequently with housing accommodations, are the differences between service animals and emotional support animals. Some of you may already know that service animals do not need to be registered with our office. So if you have a service animal, you do not have to ask for a housing accommodation to have your service animal with you. However, if you do use a service animal, it's likely that you might also be eligible for some academic accommodations. So in that case, you could still go ahead and apply through our regular process for academic accommodations. However, you will not need a housing accommodation for your service animal. The difference comes in is if your animal is an emotional support animal rather than a service animal. And under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the main law that governs our services, ESAs are not considered service animals. And the difference is that ESAs are not specially trained to perform a specific task. Instead, emotional support animals generally alleviate psychiatric symptoms such as loneliness, anxiety, or depression. But again, they do not have specialized training where they perform a specific task. So they are not necessarily trained to alert someone, perhaps that they're going to have a seizure, or they are not trained to open the door for someone. So that would be the difference between an ESA and a service animal. It's important to know that if you are approved for an ESA, the ESA only can be is only allowed in your residence. So you cannot take them anywhere else, like taking them to class with you or in any other buildings on campus. Of course, you can take them outdoors for nature breaks, but the housing approval for an ESA would only be related to your residence hall. And of course, if you would like to request an ESA as an accommodation, you would, of course, need to follow the application process. So you would apply for our services. Once we approved you for an emotional support animal, housing would take over from there. And of course, they are going to ask for things like vet records. They are going to talk to you about some safety concerns and some of the regulations that govern emotional support animals, so that you have a full understanding of what your responsibilities are in terms of ensuring that the ESA is within regulation. So some of our frequently asked questions that we get, which we are going to ask Sarah, who is our representative from University Housing, to jump in with us and answer some of these questions. So Sarah, one of the benefits of living on campus, of course, is that there's so many supports that are offered for students in our residence halls. And so we were hoping that you could share with us what supports University Housing has put in place to ensure that students have a safe and comfortable living space on campus.
Sure. So in addition to everything that every FSU student gets, which, is the FSU Police Department, this counseling center, different resources that are on campus, specifically in a residence hall, you have your resident assistant, your RA, and you have hall staff. So every hall has a full-time hall coordinator that oversees all of the RAs. And there's also night staff for the late hours. And that means that the desk of your building is always manned or always has someone on call. So anytime if you're experiencing an emergency, or if it's just 2 a.m. and you're out of toilet paper, there is a staff member available. And they are trained on different policies and procedures at FSU and within our residence halls. So there's that layer of support there just on a logistical level. And then additionally, your RA is going to be regularly checking in to making sure you're doing good, loving FSU, if you have any concerns, and they will organize activities and you'll sign in when you go to those, so they'll be able to see how you're engaging with everyone. So there's a lot of opportunities for connection and engagement when you live on campus with your fellow residents.
And, I think you really brought up two things that are they're important to all students, but especially students with disabilities. Oftentimes knowing that there's that person at the front desk that you can go to if you experience an emergency, especially one related to your disability. And then also that sense of community engagement that you mentioned. It's so important as especially for our students with a mental health diagnosis, that they can feel that sense of security, knowing that there's companionship nearby. So those are some really great points you brought up. Another common concern that we have among our incoming students is living with a roommate, especially someone they might not have met before. And we're wondering what procedures you have in place to assist students with adjusting to a roommate.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, when you get your assignment, you'll get your roommate's name and their FSU email. So that's the only contact information we can provide. A lot of people have success finding their roommate on social media as well, but you get their name before you move in. So you're able to reach out to them at least through the FSU email, introduce yourself, figure out who's bringing a microwave and a shower curtain and everything. And that's also an opportunity to, just let them know more about you, and to learn more about them. And then once you arrive and everyone's moved in, you'll complete what we call a roommate agreement. And that's where you and your roommate, and usually also your suite mates, are going to sit down with your RA and basically discuss how best to respect each other in the shared space. And you're going to do that even if you've requested your best friend from high school to live with. This is a new experience for most people coming to FSU for the first time. You don't have your parent coming in to making sure you're going to class and everything. So sometimes your habits will change. And so we like to get it on paper at the beginning, how we've discussed with you guys how you're going to respect each other. And that can always be revisited and revised if your habits change, if what you're comfortable with changes. That also means that we really want to encourage students to have adult conversations with each other, as the young adults that you are, and discuss, any conflicts. We take you through a conflict resolution process before we would just say, okay, we'll move you. We want you to try to, have a conversation and learn those skills as well. It's part of attending a university like this, is we build those life skills in addition to your academic skills.
Yes, absolutely. And I love that idea because one of the things at the OAS that we're always promoting is that self-advocacy, right? Like talking to the people in your life, especially in the college scenario, like talking to your professors about what your needs are. And that's such a great opportunity for students to have those conversations. So I love that you guys, provide a structured place for them to do that. Another question that we often receive that's kind of related to that is that a lot of students with disabilities are often unsure how to answer their roommate or their friends' questions about their housing accommodations. So they might be like, well, hey, how did you get a single room by yourself? And we were kind of wondering, what suggestions do you have for them when people ask them these types of questions?
Sure. So housing is never going to disclose to someone else that's not you or on your release of information that you have an accommodation. Even if it's your roommate and they're calling to, ask a question about the extra fridge or something like that, we're not going to be the ones to disclose anything like that. So similar to an ESA, I would say we don't tell anyone that they have an ESA. We use the term approved animal. So there we use as vague language as possible. So specifically in the example you gave where a student has a single room and they're not sure how to address that, no one knows your contract number and no one knows what preferences you submitted to the university. And so I think it would be totally fine to say like, oh, well, contracts, what I submitted, this is where I ended up. And, what you share about your circumstances is up to you. We don't ask ever that a student discloses their accommodation to someone else. Even if you're approved for an ESA and we're telling your roommate that there's going to be an animal in the space, we use the term, like I said, approved animal, and that can be any number of things. So it's really up to the student to decide what they're comfortable with. We're never going to disclose that they have an accommodation for a specific room type or something like that.
Great. And I know our students appreciate that confidentiality so much because oftentimes their experience is very personal, right? And we want to leave that choice to self-disclose up to them. So we really appreciate that language. And then we also know that your university housing does a great job with programming. What events can some of our students look forward to as we continue through the summer and head into fall?
Yeah, we have our welcome week for students. It's not as big for the summer, especially with some COVID precautions still in place. But for the fall, I believe responsibly bringing back Welcome Week is a big priority. You can go to welcome.fsu.edu for more information about those programs. And then specifically, once we're in the swing of things for the fall, your individual RAs are going to be planning their programming for their residents. Some great examples that I had as a resident was a night where we learned about bystander intervention, and at the end of it we all got Chinese food. We also had an RA organize tango lessons from the Tango Club at FSU. And then the next week we had our hall prom where everyone in the hall got all dressed up and we took fun pictures and danced and stuff like that. So the tango lesson was, an intro to that. So there's always a lot of fun programming going on with RAs and hall events and things like that. In addition to always clubs, intramurals, anything really, I bet there's a club for it. You'll walk around and you'll see people tabling or having a party out on Landis, and you can find your group of people.
Yep, absolutely. You guys do a great job with programming, and it's a lot of things fun to look forward to, especially since we have been restricted over the last year and a half. I think students will really be excited about those things this year. And then do you just have any other success tips that you might recommend for students who live in the university housing?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say open mind is a great thing. We talked about that roommate piece, and we talked about getting involved in campus and things like that. Your roommate is also going to be a nervous freshman, most likely. And if everyone comes in with an open mind, and I always say open hearts too, give what you would like to receive in terms of understanding and be ready for a really fun experience, a really great experience. And also don't be afraid to ask for support when you need it, because there's so many places on campus where you can find it. If you're not comfortable with, your RA, you have a hall coordinator. And if you're not comfortable with the hall coordinator, there's the counseling center. You have trusted professors, you have great resources at the OAS and everything like that. So if you ever needing anything, there's probably a place on campus that provides it.
Absolutely. Those are great suggestions. And we always recommend, if you're not sure who to turn to, you can always come to our office. And we'll of course, definitely let you know who you can turn to. So with that in mind, we're going to share a couple of the success tips from the OAS, just kind of that we've, kind of learned through experience. So we always ask students to submit their application and documentation and get that intake scheduled as soon as possible. Of course, we talked about earlier, there are some priority deadlines. And this entire process, the application, documentation, and intake, do have to be done prior to that priority deadline in order for us to ensure the housing accommodation. You can always request housing accommodations after that deadline, but you definitely increase your chances of getting the request if you do it prior to the deadline. And then, of course, as we mentioned earlier, you definitely want to communicate as soon as possible with your roommate about your accommodations. And this doesn't mean disclosure, as Sarah talked about earlier. If the opportunity to do that is during that roommate agreement, you do not need to disclose, but instead we recommend that you just simply you focus on what's best for you. So perhaps you have experienced disrupted sleep as a symptom of your diagnosis. You might just say something like, hey, I sleep best when it's quiet. So I know you like to listen to music as you fall asleep. Would you mind wearing your headphones? So that way it's a great compromise. The headphones allow your roommate to still listen to their music, but you also have a quiet environment to sleep in. So we just recommend focusing on what works best for you as opposed to focusing on the symptoms or self-disclosure of your diagnosis. And then, of course, what we already said, if there is a problem or you have a concern, ask for help as soon as possible. And Sarah did a great job of mentioning all the resources that you have available to you. You have all of your residence hall staff, you have university housing, you have the OAS. We are always two great starting points when it's related to something with housing. But of course, you're going to have professors that you might develop close relationships with and feel that you can trust them in talking about these things. We always have the University Counseling Center who's available if it's something that's a more serious nature. So there are lots of resources on campus to help make sure that your housing accommodations are working for you. And of course, if you would need to reach out to us, I do have the OAS website as well as the housing website on here. And I recommend exploring those because there's a lot of great information on both. related to housing accommodations, but also related to some of the programming that Sarah mentioned. And then, of course, we have our kind of mainline emails for the OAS and housing, and then also our main phone lines. So we encourage you to reach out to us as soon as possible with any questions that you have. The sooner we can get started, get the ball rolling, of course, the more likely we are to be able to meet your needs as soon as possible. Okay. So, with that, I am going to thank everyone for attending today. We hope that this has been helpful. And of course, any specific questions that you have related to your circumstances, we highly recommend just reaching out to the OAS or to housing. And of course, if we will get you set on the right path and to the right people to help you resolve that concern. Okay, well, thank you again. It was wonderful to have all of you join us. We appreciate it.